Hey listener, welcome. I'm glad you could join me tonight. I'm your storyteller and I'll be your companion as you drift off to sleep. Or perhaps as you lie there wide awake, listening to this story, unsure if you'll ever fall asleep again. If you're looking for something to keep your mind occupied as the night stretches on, then I have a tale for you. One about a seemingly ordinary stop at a motel that quickly turned into something far darker than I ever expected. But don't worry, you're safe. Just listen closely. Maybe you'll understand why I can never look at motels the same way again. I was 28 when it happened. I was just starting to feel like I was getting my life together, had a decent job in marketing at a small firm, an apartment in the city, and my routine was so normal it could have been scripted. No drama, no mess. My biggest concern was which coffee shop to visit before work or when I'd get around to doing my laundry. You know the kind of life I'm talking about. Quiet, predictable, routine. But one weekend, everything changed. I had to go on a business trip for a conference, something that was supposed to be a quick, uneventful drive. The kind of trip you make every other month. The conference was in a small town a few hours from the city, and I figured it would be just another quick in and out. When I got to the area, I was tired. Didn't want to drive the extra hour back to the city after a long day. So I decided to book a room at a motel I found just off the highway. It looked old and a little run down, but I didn't mind. I wasn't looking for luxury, just a bed, a shower, and maybe some quiet time before heading back out the next day. The moment I pulled into the lot, I noticed something off. I don't know how to explain it, but there was an odd emptiness about the place. The parking lot was nearly empty, with just a few cars parked far away from the office. No lights were on in the rooms, and the neon vacancy sign buzzed lazily in the night air like it was barely trying. The office door was open, though, and I figured it was just the kind of place that didn't worry too much about appearances. I walked in. The woman behind the counter was older, maybe in her 60s. She didn't look up immediately, just shuffled some papers around before acknowledging me with a half smile. "Need a room?" she asked, her voice raspy like she hadn't spoken much that day. "Yeah," I said, glancing around. "Just for the night. I saw your sign outside." "Only got one room left," she said, eyes still down. "It's on the end of the hall. You'll be fine there." "Thanks." I felt a little weird, but I didn't think much of it. I paid her and took the key. She handed me the room key, and I couldn't help but notice how her fingers trembled as she passed it to me. It wasn't enough to be alarming, but I made a mental note of it. Maybe she was just tired. I took my stuff and headed down the hall. As I walked, I realized that the motel had a strange, almost musty smell, like old carpet mixed with stale air. The walls were thin, and I could hear muffled sounds from the other rooms, but the hall itself was eerily quiet. When I reached my room, it was fine. Nothing special. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, and there was a TV on the dresser. I threw my things on the bed, deciding to just settle in for the night and get some rest before the next day's conference. But as I walked toward the bed, something caught my eye. The window, which I had assumed was locked, had a small piece of paper wedged between the frame and the sill. It looked like a folded receipt or something. Curious, I pulled it out, unfolded it, and read the few words scrawled on it. "I see you." It wasn't a prank. The handwriting was shaky, like whoever wrote it had been in a hurry or was nervous. But who would leave something like that in a motel room? I could feel a chill creep up my spine. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a weird joke or a mistake from a previous guest. I tossed the paper aside, locked the door, and turned on the TV to distract myself. But something kept nagging at me, that feeling of being watched. After a while, I decided to go to sleep. The room was silent except for the hum of the AC unit, and I started to drift off, my mind running in the quiet dark. But then, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a knock on the door. Soft at first, then louder. 3 quick knocks, followed by a pause, then another 3. I froze. My heart started pounding. I wasn't expecting anyone, and there wasn't a logical reason for someone to be at my door. Maybe it was just a mistake, right? But who knocks like that? I waited. I could hear my breath in the silence. Whoever was at the door didn't knock again. So I decided to ignore it. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and tried to fall asleep again, but that feeling of being watched never went away. The next morning, I woke up groggy, still feeling uneasy. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just nerves from the trip, and went downstairs to grab a quick coffee before heading out. The old woman was behind the desk again. She didn't look up as I walked past her, but I swear I caught a glimpse of something on her face. A look of recognition, maybe? Like she knew me already. It sent another shiver down my spine, but I just nodded and left. That was when things really started to get strange. The following night, I stayed at the same motel on my way back. I didn't really want to. Something about the place still felt off, but it was late, and I didn't want to risk driving too far in unfamiliar territory. When I walked in, the same woman was there, but this time, she didn't look at me when I came in. Her eyes were focused on something on the counter, something I couldn't see. I approached her, but she didn't say anything. Just handed me the key. I asked for a different room this time, one that wasn't so close to the end of the hall. She didn't respond. She just gave me the key to the same room. It was the same room, but it felt different, like someone had been there. I swear the bed had been moved slightly and the window was cracked open just a little more than it had been before. But when I checked for the paper, it wasn't there. I thought maybe I was just imagining things. But then, later that night, the knocking started again. This time, I didn't wait. I called the front desk. The woman answered, but her voice was shaky. She told me that I had to leave, that I wasn't welcome there. I don't know why, but I listened. I packed my things, grabbed my keys, and left. As I was walking to my car, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing in the dark just outside the motel. I didn't stop to look closer. I didn't want to know. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove off as fast as I could. When I got home, I felt like I could finally breathe. But the weird thing is, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching me. Sometimes when I go to bed, I feel like someone is standing outside my window, just waiting for me to fall asleep, and I never, ever look at motels the same way anymore. Sometimes the scariest part isn't what happened. It's knowing it could happen again. If you ever find yourself in a place that feels off, trust your gut. Because sometimes the things we ignore are the things that can get us killed. Story 2. Tonight, I'll tell you about a place that seems perfectly ordinary, but there's a darkness that clings to it. It's the kind of thing that makes you question how much of your own world you really know. But don't worry, it's just a story. Or is it? I was 32 when it happened. It was around the middle of June, so I can still remember the heat, that dry summer air, the kind that sticks to your skin no matter how much you try to brush it off. I was working in sales at the time, so I spent most of my days driving from one small town to the next, meeting clients, checking in on projects. Just another day, right? Just another work trip. I'll tell you now, I never thought anything could go wrong on a trip like that. When you're in the car, driving across towns, stopping at gas stations, motels, and small eateries, you get used to it. You're just passing through, like a shadow in a place that doesn't remember your name. That's how it was supposed to be. Safe, ordinary, boring even. But that was before I stayed at the Golden Creek Motel. It wasn't much, just a place to rest for the night. One of those motels off the main road. The kind that looks a little run down, but not enough to raise an eyebrow. You know the type. Neon lights flickering in the dark, the scent of stale carpet mixed with disinfectant, the sound of a buzzing air conditioner. Oh, place where you don't expect anything to happen, but somehow that's exactly when the worst things do. I checked in around 11 p.m. after a long day of meetings. The receptionist, an older man with thick glasses and a weathered face, barely looked up when I walked in. He was hunched over some paperwork, but I could hear the quiet rattle of his breath as I approached the counter. "Room 17, please," I said, trying to sound polite but exhausted. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just flipped through the old register. His fingers lingered on the page for a moment before he scribbled something down and handed me the key. "You're sure room 17 is available?" I asked, just to clarify. He nodded. His face was unreadable. I took the key and made my way down the dimly lit corridor. As I passed room 17, I couldn't help but notice the light was on, shining out from beneath the door. It was almost too bright. I don't know how else to explain it. Like someone had left it on and it never turned off. I shrugged it off at the time. Maybe someone was staying there. Maybe the light had been left on by mistake. Still, there was something about it that stuck with me. The next day, I woke up early. The motel had that typical half-awake vibe in the morning. Quiet, slow. I got dressed, grabbed my things, and headed for the lobby to check out. As I passed room 17 again, I noticed something strange. The curtains were perfectly still. No wind, no movement, just a heavy stillness. I caught myself staring at it for a moment. I swear, the curtains weren't just still, they looked thick. Almost like they were made of something heavier than usual fabric, like they were meant to keep something hidden. I didn't want to seem weird, so I hurried out of the corridor and made my way to the receptionist. He was still hunched over, this time tapping at an old computer. I could barely hear the clack of the keys over the hum of the air conditioning. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost too low. "Yeah," I said, "but, room 17. It's always booked, right?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He paused for a second, then nodded quickly, not meeting my eyes. "Yes, always. Room 17's always booked." I could feel his discomfort, like something was off with the way he said it. He didn't elaborate. I took my receipt and left, but that weird feeling clung to me. I told myself it was nothing, just an old man, probably tired. Maybe room 17 was the best room, and it was booked by regulars. Maybe there was something about it I didn't understand. Still, I couldn't shake that strange sensation, like something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out exactly what. A week passed, and then it happened again. I was driving through the area for another job, and the hotel seemed like the best option. I'd stayed there before. It was familiar. I checked in at around midnight. Same receptionist, same quiet demeanor. But this time, when I passed room 17, I stopped. I had to stop. Something about it felt different. The light was on again, yes, but now there was a sound. At first I thought it was just my imagination, maybe the air conditioner or the pipes making strange noises. But then I heard it again. A faint, rhythmic tapping, knocking. It was coming from inside the wall, right where room 17 would have been. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe someone was in there, knocking on the wall for some reason. Maybe it was a plumbing issue. But then I remembered there wasn't anyone staying in room 17. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to convince myself I was just hearing things, but the knocking kept going, steady like a slow, deliberate rhythm. My mind raced as I stood there, frozen in the hall. I wanted to go knock on the door, ask what was going on, but something held me back. Maybe it was the look in the receptionist's eyes when he'd handed me that key. The way he seemed so uncomfortable, like he knew something I didn't. The knocking stopped after a few minutes, and I quickly got into my room. I told myself it was nothing, just some old plumbing, some weird noise. But my mind wouldn't stop going back to it. The knocking, it sounded too intentional, too familiar. A few more weeks went by, and I had completely forgotten about room 17 until I heard about it again, this time from a local waitress at a diner I was stopping at. "Stay away from room 17, honey," she said, leaning in with a knowing look when I casually mentioned the motel. "People who stay in that room, they always leave quickly. You never see them again." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean, never see them again?" She gave me a sharp look, one that told me she wasn't joking. "Just don't ask too many questions, okay? Room 17? It's always booked, but nobody checks in." A year has passed since that night, but I still can't shake it. I've been back to that motel a few more times. I've even stayed in the same room, but the knocking? the strange feel of room 17. It never leaves me. I've tried to forget about it, but sometimes when I'm alone, I hear the tapping, not from a wall, but from somewhere much closer. So, if you're ever driving through that town and you pass by a small motel with the sign flickering in the night, I'd suggest you keep going. Don't look at the lights in room 17. Don't even think about it. Trust me, you don't want to know what's inside. Story 3. This story is about a place where the ordinary turns unsettling, where things vanish without a trace, and where the only thing that remains is a cold, empty room. Now, let me take you back a few years. I was 24 at the time, living alone in a small town about 2 hours outside the city. My life was normal, predictable even. I worked at a call center 9 to 5, mostly handling customer complaints about things like bad internet service or late deliveries. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I had a few friends, a family I saw once in a while, and a cat named Winston. The days were long, and sometimes the nights felt even longer. But that was it. There was nothing in my life that would have prepared me for what happened at that motel. It all started one Friday night when I decided to get away from the city for a weekend. I wasn't running from anything, just looking for a change of scenery. I didn't want to go too far, so I found a little motel just off the highway. It wasn't fancy, just a small 2-story building with neon lights flickering on the sign that read, "Rest In Motel." When I pulled in, the parking lot was nearly empty, with only 1 or 2 cars scattered around. The kind of place where you don't expect much. You check in, sleep, and leave. The woman behind the desk was polite enough. She didn't ask too many questions, just handed me the key to room 13 and told me the usual, breakfast at 7, no smoking inside, that sort of thing. Nothing about the place stood out to me at the time. The room was clean enough. Old carpet, a simple bed, a TV, and a lamp that flickered every now and then, but nothing to raise alarms. I set my bag down, took a quick shower, and then sat down to a sandwich I'd packed for dinner. It was a quiet night, the kind of quiet that makes you feel a little too alone. The wind rustled outside, and I could hear a car passing every so often, but beyond that, nothing. No voices, no laughter, just silence. Then, something strange happened. Around 11:30, I noticed a car pulling into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I glanced out the window and saw a man get out, dragging a suitcase behind him. He looked a little older than me, mid-30s maybe, wearing a brown jacket and dark pants. Nothing unusual, but there was something about the way he moved. His head was down, and he was walking fast, like he was trying to avoid being seen. He glanced up once, his eyes catching mine for just a second through the blinds. I quickly looked away, telling myself I was being paranoid. I didn't think much more of it until the next morning. I woke up to a quiet, still morning. No traffic, no noise. I made my way downstairs to get breakfast, but when I passed room 13, I noticed the door was ajar. It wasn't open wide, just enough to see inside. My first thought was that maybe I'd left it unlocked when I went to bed the night before. But when I pushed it open, my stomach dropped. The bed was perfectly made, and the room was tidy, except for the food. There, on the small table by the window, was a half-eaten breakfast, eggs, toast, and a cup of coffee. It looked fresh, like someone had just set it there. But there was no sign of anyone. No luggage, no personal items, nothing. The bed hadn't been slept in. The whole room was completely untouched. I froze, confused. How could someone check in, eat breakfast, and then vanish? The strange thing was that the motel owner, the woman I'd seen the night before, was standing in the hallway. I turned to her and she smiled, like it was all perfectly normal. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice calm and almost bored. I think there's been a mix-up with my room," I said, pointing to the untouched breakfast in the empty space. "Someone stayed here last night, but there's no one here now." She glanced at the room, then back at me, her smile not wavering. "We never had anyone in that room." I stared at her, not sure what to say. "What do you mean? No one," she repeated, as if she hadn't even heard me. "There's no one in room 13. There hasn't been for weeks." I didn't know how to respond. I was about to argue when she suddenly turned and walked away, heading down the stairs without another word. I felt a chill run through me as I stood there, looking at the untouched breakfast. A feeling of dread started creeping in, one I couldn't shake. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe I had misunderstood something. But how could that food still be warm? How could anyone check out without leaving anything behind? I tried to push it out of my mind, telling myself it was just an odd coincidence. I grabbed my things and checked out, but the whole drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. It didn't make sense. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing strange rumors about the place. It wasn't something that came up in conversation easily, but little bits of information started slipping through. A friend of mine had stayed at the Rest Inn Motel a few months before I did, and she told me she'd heard similar stories about guests who checked in but never seemed to check out. One day they were there, and the next, gone. No luggage, no signs of struggle, just empty rooms. The most chilling part? The motel owner always insisted there had never been anyone in those rooms. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard something even stranger. A news story popped up on my feed. A woman had gone missing near that same area. She'd checked into a hotel the night before, and when her husband went to check on her in the morning, her room was empty, just like the others. The police couldn't figure out what had happened, but they did find something. The woman's luggage had been left behind, and her breakfast was still sitting on the table untouched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I read that article. The same thing. The same damn thing. I didn't go back to that motel, of course. In fact, I avoided that stretch of highway entirely. But months later, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that place. Every time I drove past it, I'd glance at the neon sign and think about the rooms, about the people who vanished without a trace. I've told myself that maybe it's all coincidence, but deep down, I know better. Sometimes there's just a feeling you can't explain, a feeling that something's wrong, that things don't add up, and that you should stay far away. So if you ever find yourself driving late at night and you see a quiet little motel off the side of the road, think twice before you check in. You never know who or what might be staying there. And if you ever find yourself in room 13, remember, don't leave anything behind, because you might not be the only one staying there. Story 4. This tale is about a strange experience I had years ago. It's been a while, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. I don't know if I'll ever truly be able to explain what happened, but I know it changed the way I see the world. Let me take you back. It was 5 years ago, and I was 27 at the time. I had a job as a project manager for a small marketing firm. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I was single, living in a tiny apartment in the city, and generally, life felt safe, boring even. There was no excitement, no real drama, just the usual routine of work, eat, sleep, repeat. One weekend, I decided to take a road trip. No real destination in mind. Just wanted to get out of the city, clear my head, maybe visit a few small towns on the way. I didn't make any hotel reservations. Figured I'd just stop when I got tired. That's how I ended up at a little motel in the middle of nowhere. It was a cheap rundown place with faded neon lights that barely flickered, and the kind of place that you drive by and don't give a second glance. The sign out front read, "Roadway Inn," in chipped white paint, with a small, rusty gas station beside it. The parking lot was nearly empty, and I felt a little uneasy as I pulled in, but it was late, and I was too tired to keep going. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the entrance. The air had that odd, stale smell, like dust and old cigarettes mixed with something I couldn't place. As I opened the door to the lobby, the bell above it rang, and the sound echoed through the small room. Behind the counter, there was a man, maybe in his mid-50s, dressed in a faded shirt with the motel's logo stitched onto the pocket. His eyes were hidden behind thick, round glasses that made him look a little like a librarian, except for the way he stared. He didn't greet me, just stared at me with an intensity that felt off. The air around us seemed to freeze for a moment, but I figured it was just my imagination. I smiled and went up to the counter. "Hi, I'd like to get a room for the night," I said, trying to break the awkward tension. He nodded slowly and handed me a key without saying a word, just a quiet motion toward the small hallway that led to the rooms. The whole time, he didn't blink. Not once. I remember thinking how strange it was. It wasn't that he was glaring or looking at me in any threatening way. He just didn't blink. His eyes were wide open, and he just stared as if he were frozen in place. But I dismissed it as exhaustion. I told myself I was being silly. Maybe he was just tired, too. I thanked him and made my way to the room. It was basic. Cracked wallpaper, a bed with a worn-out quilt, and a flickering lamp in the corner. But at that point, all I wanted was sleep. I locked the door, took a shower, and climbed into bed. But as I lay there, drifting off, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept thinking about the clerk, about how he just stared, wide-eyed, without ever blinking. I convinced myself that it didn't mean anything. Maybe he had some condition or something. But deep down, a small voice in my head whispered that it was strange. I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, I woke up early, stretched, and grabbed my things. I needed coffee. Badly. As I passed through the lobby again, I saw him sitting behind the counter, still there, still staring. But this time, he was even more noticeable. It was like he was watching me from the moment I entered, his eyes following me with that same unblinking gaze. I forced myself to look away, to not acknowledge the creepiness of it all, but I could feel him watching me as I went to the vending machine in the corner. I didn't stop to talk to him, didn't even attempt any small talk. I grabbed my coffee and headed back to the room to check out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about him. The way he looked at me, like he knew me, or worse, like he was waiting for something. That night, I stayed again. Same room. I was too tired to keep driving, and the idea of finding another motel in the dark seemed like too much effort. Besides, I figured if I ignored him, the clerk would leave me alone. But as I walked past the lobby again, heading to my room, he was there, still sitting behind the counter. And as I passed, he didn't look up like usual. Instead, he just tilted his head, slowly, like he was taking a mental photograph of me. The unease grew, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I went back to my room, locked the door, and sat by the window, trying to watch the streetlights flicker. That's when I noticed something strange outside. There was no car parked next to mine. It was a tiny detail, something I almost overlooked, but I remembered clearly that when I parked, there was a car next to mine, an old sedan with peeling paint. Now, it was gone. I shook it off. Could have been a mistake. Maybe someone had checked out earlier. But then I heard something that stopped me cold. A soft knock on the door. I froze, heart racing, not sure if I had heard it right. I waited for a few seconds. Then the knock came again, louder this time. 3 knocks, firm, deliberate. I stood still, too afraid to move. I didn't even want to go near the peephole in case someone was watching. After what felt like hours, the knocking stopped. I waited and waited. Eventually, I managed to gather the courage to go to the door, and when I opened it, there was no one there, not a soul in sight. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, my eyes glued to the door, too terrified to close them. The next morning, I checked out early, too shaken to stay another second. It wasn't until a few days later that I learned the truth. The night clerk I had seen at the motel, he had died in the motel 5 years earlier. A heart attack, they said. He had been working there alone that night, and nobody found him until the morning. His body was still behind that very counter when I saw him, looking just as alive as I did. Now, every time I stay at a motel, I always make sure to check the lobby. I can't help but wonder if there are others like him out there. People who never leave, who just watch and wait. If you're ever in a cheap, quiet motel and you notice a clerk staring at you without blinking, remember this story. Sometimes the scariest part isn't what happened. It's knowing it could happen again. Story 5. This is a story about a motel, one of those roadside motels you pass by on long drives through small towns, the kind you barely notice. But sometimes, the quietest places hide the strangest things. So let's begin. My name is Lucas, and at the time of this story, I was 27 years old. I had been traveling for work, sales mostly. It's a pretty mundane job, but it pays the bills, and I got to see a lot of places. That's what I was doing one late evening in early fall, driving across the state to meet a client the next day. The whole trip was supposed to be routine, just a few meetings, a night in a cheap motel, then back on the road. But of course, it didn't turn out that way. It was around 11 p.m. when I arrived at the motel. I had already been driving for almost 8 hours, and I was exhausted. The motel wasn't anything special. It was an old place, probably built in the 70s with neon signs flickering in the dim light. I remember the smell of musty carpets and the faint hum of a window unit air conditioner. It didn't look like the kind of place you'd want to spend the night, but I didn't have many options. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and walked into the lobby. The desk clerk, an older man, barely looked up when I walked in. He just grunted, handed me a key, and told me I was in room 214. I didn't ask too many questions. It wasn't until I walked down the dimly lit hallway that I started to feel a little off. It wasn't anything specific, just the kind of feeling you get when something's slightly wrong. I opened the door to my room and tossed my bag on the bed. The room was as basic as they come: a bed, a lamp, a dresser, and a tiny bathroom. I made a quick call to my wife to let her know I'd made it safely and then tried to settle in for the night. I was just about to turn off the lights when the phone on the nightstand rang. I almost ignored it. Who calls a motel room at this hour? But the sound of the ringing cut through the silence and it nagged at me. So I picked it up. Hello? There was a long pause on the other end, then a voice, muffled and strange. Are you okay in there? I was caught off guard. Yeah, I'm fine, I replied. Who is this? There was no answer, just the sound of breathing, heavy and slow. Then the line went dead. I hung up, shook my head, and chalked it up to a prank. I mean, who calls a motel room like that? I wasn't about to lose sleep over it, but as I was about to set the phone back down, it rang again. This time, I let it go. I had enough of weirdos for one night, but the ringing didn't stop. It just kept going, a constant, insistent buzz. After a few more minutes, I picked it up again. Hello? This time, the voice was clearer, but still something was off about it. I hear you. You're not alone in there. I froze. My heart started racing. The voice sounded like it was coming from just outside the room, but there was no way anyone could have gotten that close without me hearing them. I didn't know what to say. What do you want? But the voice didn't respond. Instead, there was a sharp click, and the line went dead. I sat there, staring at the phone. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a prank from someone in another room, or just a glitch in the phone system. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I lay back down, tried to ignore the creeping unease in my gut, and turned off the lights. The next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of the phone ringing again. This time, it was much earlier, maybe around 4 a.m. My head felt heavy, my body stiff. I was confused, disoriented. I grabbed the receiver, my voice hoarse from sleep. Hello? The voice was louder this time, more distinct, almost frantic. You're not alone. They're in there with you. The screams. I hear them. I wasn't sure what to say. I was half awake, but the words sunk into me like cold water. Screams? I asked, my voice trembling. Yes, I hear them. Someone's in your room with you. I looked around the room, wide-eyed, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. I felt ridiculous, staring at the empty walls. It was all in my head, right? I was just sleep-deprived, imagining things. Before I could respond, the line went dead again. I wasn't sure what to do. I left the room to go to the front desk, hoping to speak to the clerk to get some kind of explanation. Maybe the calls were just some weird glitch, or maybe someone was messing with me. When I got to the desk, the clerk was asleep, slouched over with a half-empty coffee cup in front of him. I didn't bother waking him. Instead, I decided to go back to my room and try to get a little more sleep. But as I walked, down the hallway, I noticed something strange. Room 212, just across the hall from mine, had its door slightly ajar. A faint light flickered from within. I was too curious for my own good. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The light kept flickering. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. There was no one inside. The room was completely empty, but the phone on the nightstand was ringing. I immediately backed out of the room and shut the door, my heart racing. I went back to my own room, but when I opened the door, I was struck by the oddest sensation. I felt as though someone had been inside, but I hadn't left the room at all. That's when the phone rang again. This time, I picked it up immediately. "It's not you," the voice said. "It's them. They're in your room and I'm trying to help you." I was frozen. What was going on? But before I could ask anything else, I heard something strange. Faint whispers like a crowd murmuring in the background, followed by a soft, almost inaudible scream. The phone went dead. I didn't know what to do anymore. Something was seriously wrong. The calls kept coming, one after another, always about screams, always about someone being in my room. But here's the twist. When I checked with the front desk the next morning, I found out something that made my blood run cold. Room 212, the one across the hall, the one with the open door and the ringing phone, had been empty for weeks. The line was disconnected. The number showing up on my phone was from a disconnected line. No one had called me, but someone had been watching me. Someone had been messing with me. I still don't know who or what was behind those calls, but ever since that night, I've never stayed in a motel room again. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear the distant ringing of a phone, and I wonder if they're still out there, watching me. Because some things don't stay buried. Sometimes, the scariest part isn't what happened. It's knowing it could happen again. Story 6. It's about a place that shouldn't exist, and yet there I was, trapped in it, unsure if I was losing my mind or if something much worse was happening. It's about a motel that moved when I wasn't looking. I'm Matt. At the time this all happened, I was 28. I worked in digital marketing, which meant a lot of late nights on the computer and some pretty mind-numbing hours spent in meetings. The kind of work where you get stuck in your own head, not really paying attention to where you are or who you're talking to. My life was normal, boring even. I had a couple of friends, a small studio apartment in the city, and not much to complain about. It wasn't much of a life to brag about, but it was mine. That was until I had to travel for work, just a quick 2-day conference about social media algorithms or something equally as uninspiring. I booked a cheap motel on the edge of town, figuring I'd save a little money. It was one of those places where the rooms cost half of what you'd pay at a regular hotel, and that should have been my first warning. I can't even remember the name of the motel now, just that it was a little rundown, tucked between a gas station and a diner, with a sign that flickered constantly. You know the type. The kind of place where the carpet smells faintly of old coffee, and the hallways have that faint, musty feeling. Nothing special, nothing dangerous, or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. I checked in at the front desk. There was an older man working the counter who barely looked up from his newspaper when I asked for my room key. I didn't think much of it. He seemed a little distracted, maybe a bit lonely. I dragged my suitcase down a narrow hallway, the kind that always feels too quiet. The dim yellow light buzzed overhead. The door to my room creaked when I opened it, and the air smelled like stale air freshener. I set my stuff down, turned on the TV, and ordered some takeout. That night, as I lay in bed, the hum of the old air conditioner was the only sound. The room was the kind you forget as soon as you leave, nondescript and dull. But the next morning, that's when things got strange. I woke up, took a quick shower, and headed out for breakfast. The motel wasn't anything to write home about, but I was in a rush, so I didn't really take in my surroundings. Here's where the first odd thing happened. When I stepped out of my room, the hallway was different. Now, I know what you're thinking. Matt, you're tired, you probably didn't notice. But no, I'm telling you, the hallway was different. The door to my room, room 9, was now on the left instead of the right. The walls felt closer. The carpet, it wasn't the same shade of brown as it had been the night before. I shook it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was still half asleep. It wasn't until I reached the lobby that things took a deeper turn. The lobby was gone. I mean, gone. The front desk where the old man had been sitting. It wasn't there. Instead, there was a small open space with a row of vending machines, and a younger guy in a polo shirt was standing behind a desk that didn't belong. I asked him, "Is this the same motel?" He looked at me like I was crazy. "Yeah, of course. Where else would it be?" I let it go. It wasn't worth arguing over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I walked back to my room, room 9, I checked, and tried to push it out of my mind. The day went on, but the weirdness didn't stop. That evening I went to grab dinner, and when I came back to the motel, the lobby was different again. The walls were a shade darker. The hallway was longer, and I swear the carpet had changed pattern. The door to my room, room 9, it wasn't there. Instead, there was room 12. I froze. I walked down the hall, trying to shake off the panic creeping up my spine. Maybe I'd had a few too many beers at dinner. Maybe I was just tired. But room 12 wasn't my room. I knew that much. I reached the door and knocked, and when I did, I could hear the same man from earlier, the one who had checked me in, talking to someone inside. I didn't stay to eavesdrop. I just turned around and went back to the front desk. The guy at the counter didn't seem to notice my concern. I asked him, "Hey, I'm in room 9. Where's that?" He smiled and said, "You're in room 12, man. Been that way since you checked in." I didn't know what to say. I was too tired to argue, too confused to make sense of it. And that was the first time I realized this wasn't just me overthinking. Something was changing. The motel wasn't just a place, it was moving. I don't know how else to explain it. And it wasn't just the rooms either. The entire building felt like it was shifting while I was asleep. The next morning, the lobby was back to where it had been when I first checked in, but now the hallway was a little shorter, and the door to room 9 was where it had been the first time I'd walked through. I knew I had to leave, but I had this nagging feeling that if I checked out, I might never be able to leave at all. Like the motel would just follow me. I stayed that second night. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. I'd step outside for a minute, come back, and the layout would be different again. The hallway would change, the room numbers would shift. I started to notice things that were out of place. Small things like the curtains in the lobby being a different color or the vending machines switching locations. It all felt like a dream, or worse, a nightmare that kept looping. On my last night, I finally packed my bags, convinced I had to get out. But when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. The key card wouldn't work. The lobby was gone again. Just vending machines and a row of chairs that weren't there before. I don't know how long I sat there, pressing the button for help, but no one ever came. The hours dragged on. Eventually, when I tried the door again, it opened and I ran out into the parking lot. But when I looked back, the motel was completely different. The sign flickered once more, and I swear it was facing the wrong direction. I left, and I didn't look back. That was a few years ago. I still don't understand what happened. I don't know if I was losing my mind, or if I really had stepped into a place that shouldn't have existed. All I know is that places like that stay with you. They change you, make you doubt everything. Now, I can't stay in motels. I can't even walk down certain hallways without feeling the weight of it all again. I check my locks twice before I sleep, and sometimes I hear sounds in the night, like someone walking just outside my door. But I'm not sure. What's worse? The fear that it might happen again, or the nagging thought that it might already be happening somewhere else. Maybe the worst part isn't that the motel moved. Maybe it's that we never really leave. We just end up where we're supposed to be. Sometimes when I look around and something feels off, I wonder if the building is already shifting, waiting for me to blink and find myself back there. Maybe one day I'll step outside, and the world will change again. Story 7. I'll take you to a place I once thought was perfectly ordinary. A small town, a quiet motel, a job I needed just to get by. It wasn't anything special. But sometimes, when you least expect it, the things you think are safe start to unravel. And when they do, you'll be left wondering if you really know who's walking down the hallway. I used to work at a motel. It was one of those small, run-down places off the highway, barely more than a couple of buildings with a few rooms each. Nothing glamorous. I was just a 22-year-old college student trying to make ends meet, and I figured a night shift job would work fine for me. I didn't care about the place. The people who came and went didn't matter. I mostly kept to myself, just checked in guests, cleaned up, and made sure everything was in order. It was a small town. You could always hear the sound of distant cars on the highway, especially in the dead of night when everything else was quiet. The motel was mostly empty, maybe a guest or two on a busy weekend. Most of the time, I'd sit behind the front desk with a cup of coffee, reading whatever book I was into at the time, and watching the clock tick by. But one night, something happened. Something that made me start questioning everything I thought I knew. It started with a knock. Around 2:30 a.m., I was halfway through a chapter when I heard it. Just a single, firm knock on the door. Knock, knock, knock. I looked up, confused. It wasn't unusual to hear someone knocking at that hour, but it was strange that it was so late. No one should have been checking in. The lobby was quiet. I glanced through the security monitor. There was no one outside. That's when I heard the voice, muffled through the door. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm the night manager. I was just checking in on you. Is everything okay with your room?" My heart skipped a beat. I frowned. Night manager? I'd been working there for a few weeks already, and I was pretty sure I'd never seen anyone who even resembled a night manager. I got up, walked to the door, and cracked it open just enough to see the figure. A man, mid-30s maybe, dressed in a dark uniform, stood there with a friendly but oddly unsettling smile. His eyes were wide, a little too wide, and he spoke in a way that was almost too rehearsed. "Everything all right?" he asked again. I blinked. I don't think we have a night manager anymore." The man didn't seem to react. Instead, he gave a stiff nod. Right. I'm just helping out tonight. Is your room all right?" Something about the way he said it felt off. I told him I was fine, but he lingered for a second longer before turning and walking away without a word. I stood there in the doorway for a while, feeling a strange mix of confusion and unease. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was new. Maybe I hadn't been briefed properly. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next night, he came back. I was sitting at the front desk and I could hear his footsteps before I saw him. He knocked again, just like before. "Everything okay with your room, ma'am?" His tone hadn't changed at all. In fact, it sounded more rehearsed than the night before. This time, I asked him directly, "Who are you? Are you really the night manager?" The man looked taken aback for a split second. Then, just as quickly, he gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Just checking in?" He turned away before I could say anything else. Something was wrong, and I couldn't quite figure out what. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was working too many hours. I asked the other staff about the man, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. "We don't have a night manager anymore," one of the housekeepers told me, shaking her head. "Not since the accident." The way she said it made my skin crawl. The accident? What accident? No one had ever told me about an accident, but the strange thing was, I couldn't find anyone who could tell me exactly what happened. Whenever I asked about it, the employees would just get quiet and change the subject. It was like no one wanted to talk about it. I couldn't let it go. Every night the man would knock on my door, asking the same question. "Is everything okay?" He'd stand there with that creepy, forced smile. And every time, I would turn him away. I started keeping the front desk locked at night, but that didn't stop him. He found ways to get around it. One time I caught him on the security camera walking around the side of the building, peering into the windows of rooms. Then came the day I found something strange in the parking lot. I was leaving the motel in the morning after my shift when I noticed a car parked in a space near the office. It was a sedan, nothing special, just a plain, older model. But when I looked closer, I saw something on the windshield. A note. I unfolded it carefully. "Everything okay with your room?" I felt my stomach twist. I hadn't told anyone about the man or the knockings. How did he know I was even working that night? The following evening, I came into work with a sick feeling in my gut. The man wasn't just knocking anymore. He was watching. It wasn't until I started piecing things together that I realized how far he'd gone to track me. He knew when I took breaks. He knew when I was working late. I started seeing his car parked in the lot at odd hours, always just out of sight, always waiting. And then it escalated. One night, around 1 a.m., there was a knock on my office door. But this time, it wasn't the man in the uniform. It was someone else, someone much worse. A police officer stood on the other side, his hand on the doorframe, asking if I had seen anything strange lately. His tone was cold, professional, but when I asked for his badge, he hesitated for a moment too long. "Just wanted to make sure everything's all right," he said, still standing too close. "Would you like me to check your room?" I should have said no, but something about the way he stood there, like he already knew my answer, made me freeze. I didn't know what to do. Then I heard the sound. A knock, another knock, just like the man's. I opened the door, and there he was, the night manager, standing with that same forced grin, looking at me as though nothing had changed. The police officer turned, his face going pale when he saw him. The man in the uniform just nodded, as if everything were normal. And then, without a word, both of them walked away together. I don't know what happened to that officer. I don't know who he was. I don't know if the night manager was just a crazy person or something worse. I left the motel shortly after that, packed up and never looked back. It's been months since I quit, and every time I see a man in a uniform, especially one who's just a little too friendly or persistent, I feel a chill run through me. I still don't know the whole story behind that man. But sometimes I wonder, what if it's not just the accident that's haunting that place? What if something else was waiting for me the whole time? I've learned to trust my instincts. If something feels off, even a little, listen. Because sometimes the scariest part isn't what happens. It's realizing it could happen again. Story 8. It's about a time I stayed in a motel. Something that started out like any other night but ended up far worse than anything I could have imagined. I'm not sure what happened that night was just about a hidden camera or if it was something else entirely, but you'll see what I mean. I'm not the type to scare easily. I'm a 28-year-old guy, just an average office worker, nothing special. My days are usually filled with the hum of spreadsheets, client calls, and my favorite routine, coming home to a quiet apartment at the end of the day. I live in a city just outside of Portland, so the noise is never too far away, but it's enough to keep things from feeling too small. My life was comfortable, a bit boring, but I liked it that way. There was never anything too out of the ordinary. A few months ago, though, things started to shift. It wasn't a big thing, just a trip I had to make for work. It wasn't far, just a few hours' drive to a small town, where we had a client meeting scheduled for the next morning. I'd booked a room at one of those no-frills motels off the highway. You know the ones, the kind with peeling paint on the doors, the smell of stale cigarettes in the hallways, and flickering lights in the parking lot. They're cheap, and frankly, when I travel for work, I don't care too much where I stay, as long as I get a bed for the night. I arrived around 9 p.m. The weather was rainy, a typical Pacific Northwest evening. My shoes were soaked by the time I got into the lobby, and the bell above the door jingled as I walked in. The clerk behind the desk gave me a nod, handed me a key, and told me the Wi-Fi was out. I didn't care, just wanted to crash and get a good night's sleep. Room 103. It wasn't the worst place I'd ever stayed, but it wasn't great. The air smelled of old carpet and bleach, but it was clean enough. The bed was soft, and the TV flickered to life when I turned it on, so I settled in. The first strange thing happened while I was taking my shoes off. I'd noticed a faint buzzing sound coming from above me, but I dismissed it. It was probably just some old fan or the air conditioner struggling to keep up with the humidity. I shrugged and went on with my evening, scrolling through emails and answering a few messages before I decided to take a shower. That's when I noticed it. I was standing under the water, letting the heat of the shower clear my head, when I looked up at the ceiling and saw it. A tiny black lens peering down at me from the smoke detector. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't freak out immediately. It was small, almost camouflaged, but it definitely looked like a camera. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure what to do. Maybe it was just there to monitor for fires? Maybe the place had installed them after an incident? I don't know, but something about it didn't sit right. I was in the middle of nowhere, alone. There's something about being alone in a motel room that messes with your head anyway. I didn't know who might have been watching or if anyone even knew I was there. After the shower, I walked over to the desk and grabbed my phone. I checked the lock on the door, making sure it was secure. I was tired, but now my mind was running. A hidden camera? In a place like this? I debated whether to call the front desk, but then I thought, what would I even say? Hey, I think there's a camera in my room? They'd probably laugh it off, or worse, tell me I was imagining things. I knew I had to check it, so I got an idea. I'd grab the TV remote and point it towards the camera, see if it triggered anything, maybe a hidden signal. That way, if there was a camera, I'd at least know if someone was watching. I sat back on the bed, fiddling with my phone and the remote, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I turned off the lights and went back to the bed. The buzzing from the ceiling seemed louder now, and for the first time, I was seriously starting to feel uneasy. I pulled up the camera app on my phone and pointed it towards the smoke detector. That's when things got weird. The screen flashed for a second, and then the footage from the camera appeared on my phone. It wasn't just me in the frame. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. But no. There, in the corner of the room, above the smoke detector, was something sitting on the ceiling. At first, it looked like a shadow. But no, after a few seconds, I saw it more clearly. It was like a person, but not quite. Its limbs were too long, too thin. Its head was unnaturally large, and its eyes, God, its eyes, stared directly into the lens of the camera. It was just watching me, unmoving, frozen in place. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I turned my head slowly, scanning the room. Nothing, no figure, just an empty, poorly lit motel room. But the footage didn't lie. The thing on the ceiling didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there. Its eyes were the worst part. They didn't blink, they didn't look away. It wasn't like a person sitting on the ceiling either. The way its body was twisted, it couldn't possibly be human. It was more like something had taken the form of a person, but it had gotten everything wrong. I jumped up, my legs shaking, and immediately pulled my phone away from my face. I didn't know what to do next. Call the police? That seemed insane. I couldn't even explain what I'd just seen. What would they say? Oh, there's something on the ceiling, staring at me through a hidden camera. They'd think I was crazy. I rushed to the window and pulled the blinds open, trying to catch a glimpse of anything outside, maybe a car, someone watching. Nothing. Just the empty parking lot in the rain. I tried to shake it off. I really did. Told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was some prank, a weird glitch. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me after a long day of work. I turned the TV back on, hoping to distract myself, but the buzzing sound from the ceiling wouldn't stop. And then I heard it. A knock at the door. It was slow, deliberate, 3 raps, spaced out just enough to make you hesitate. I stood frozen. My mind raced. What the hell was going on? Who was out there? Was it the clerk coming to check on me? I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Then, just as I was about to peek through the peephole, the knocking stopped. It was like whoever was out there knew I was listening. I stood there for a long time, not knowing what to do. Eventually, I got the courage to open the door. No one was there, just the empty hallway stretching out in both directions. I closed the door quickly, locked it, and backed away, my eyes glued to the ceiling again, to that God-forsaken camera. But the thing on the ceiling was gone. It had moved, and I knew, just knew, it was no longer above me. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe it was an hour, maybe 2. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even think. Eventually, I did what I could to put it behind me. I checked out of the motel the next morning, walked right past the clerk without a word, and drove back home. But I still can't explain what happened. The footage, the thing on the ceiling, the knock at the door. I thought about reporting it, but I never did. I don't know if anyone would have believed me. It's been months now, and I'm still not the same. I can't stay in motels anymore. If I ever need to travel for work, I always book a nicer hotel, always make sure the room feels safe. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, even at home, even when I know I'm alone. I keep thinking about those eyes staring into the camera, and the quiet, cold, crawling fear that someone or something out there knows exactly where I am. Sometimes the scariest part isn't what happened. It's knowing it could happen again. Story 9. It was a few years ago, a time in my life when everything seemed boring, I was just out of college, living in a small town, working as a receptionist at a motel. My days were filled with checking people in, answering calls, and occasionally cleaning up rooms. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and it gave me plenty of time to think. Too much time, really. The job was simple enough, and the town I lived in was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. It was one of those towns where if you blinked, you'd miss it. The motel itself wasn't much. It was an old single-story building on the edge of town. A faded neon sign flickered above the front door, and the parking lot was always half empty, even in the summer. The regulars were mostly truckers passing through, or tourists who needed a place to stay while they were in town. I'd greet them with the same smile every time, take their keys, and send them off to their rooms. I remember one night, it was a Wednesday, kind of late. It was pouring rain, the kind of rain that makes the world look blurry, almost dreamlike. I was sitting behind the desk, half watching a TV in the corner, when the door to the lobby opened with a squeak. I looked up. He was a man in his mid-30s, tall with a scruffy beard and dark eyes that seemed a little too intense. He had this look about him, like he hadn't slept in days. He wore a faded leather jacket and boots, a bit too rugged for a motel like this, the kind of guy you'd expect to see at a dive bar, not a sleepy roadside inn. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice polite but distant, as I reached for the reservation book. He stared at me for a moment, his eyes scanning my face like he was trying to figure something out. Then he smiled. It was a strange smile, not malicious, just unsettling. "I'm just looking for a room," he said, his voice low and almost hoarse. I nodded and pulled up the computer screen. "We have a few rooms available. Are you planning to stay for the night?" He nodded slowly, but his gaze didn't leave mine. "Yeah, just for tonight. Rain's pretty bad out there, I gave him a quick nod, still not thinking much of it. The weather had been awful all day, and a lot of people stopped in for a place to crash when it rained like this. I gave him a key to one of the standard rooms, and he thanked me quietly before turning to leave. But just before he walked out the door, he glanced over his shoulder. "You have a nice night," he said, that odd, knowing smile still on his face. I didn't think anything of it at first. He was just another passerby, another lonely traveler trying to make his way through the storm. But then, I started to notice him. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The next morning, I was doing my rounds when I saw his truck parked out front again, the same one, an old black pickup. I assumed he had stayed another night, but I didn't recall seeing him at the desk when I came in. It wasn't that strange. Sometimes people just don't check out until after you leave, especially when they're on the road. But as I was walking past his room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. The first thought that came to my mind was that maybe he had gone out for something, or maybe just left it open in case the air conditioning was too cold. But then I heard something, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails on a wall. I froze. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably the wind, or maybe a rat in the walls. I didn't want to bother the guy, but something about that sound didn't sit right with me. I knocked lightly on his door. "Hello, just making sure everything's okay in there," I called. There was no response. I knocked again, a little harder. Still nothing. My heart started to pick up the pace. I knew I should have just walked away, but instead, I pushed the door open slightly. The room was empty. The bed was unmade, the sheets twisted and tangled, but there was no sign of him. Not even his bag, which struck me as strange. People don't just leave their bags behind. I stepped in, my eyes scanning the room, and then I saw it, a small piece of paper on the nightstand. It was a crumpled note. I opened it carefully, trying not to tear it. It was a simple message. "I know you're watching me. I'm watching you too." I felt my stomach drop. My mind raced. Who would leave something like that? Was it a joke? Or something more? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The days after that were strange. I started to notice the man more, even though I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. I'd see him standing by the truck, watching the road, or standing outside the lobby like he was waiting for someone. He never came in, but he was always there, watching, waiting. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that he was following me. Sometimes I'd catch him just a little too close, standing at the end of the hall, his face half hidden in the shadows. Other times, I'd see him across the street, his truck parked in the same spot, just sitting there, engine off, for hours. I wanted to tell someone, but who? The police? They'd probably think I was overreacting, that I was just paranoid. I mentioned it to a few of the other staff members, but they just shrugged it off. "You're probably just tired," one of them said. "It's a slow season. Maybe he's just hanging out." But I knew better. Something wasn't right. Then, one night, I got the feeling that I wasn't alone in the lobby. It was late, and I was about to close up. The rain had started again, pounding against the windows. I was finishing up some paperwork when I heard a soft creak behind me. I turned around. There, standing in the doorway, was the man. His eyes were wide, almost frantic, and he wasn't alone. A second figure was standing just behind him, a woman, her face hidden in shadow. I couldn't see her clearly, but I could feel her gaze on me, cold and calculating. Before I could react, he spoke, his voice low and almost pleading. "You didn't think I'd forget, did you? I know you know who I am." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what he meant. I'd never spoken to him outside of those brief moments in the lobby. "I'm calling the police," I said, my hands shaking as I reached for the phone. He didn't move, just stared at me, almost like he was daring me to do it. The silence was deafening. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The door slammed shut, and I was left standing there, my hand still hovering over the phone. I did call the police, but when they arrived, there was no trace of them. No truck, no woman. It was like they had vanished into thin air. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe I'll never know. But the thing that scares me the most is that I'm not sure it's over. I moved away a few months after that, but there's something about that place, about that motel, that I can't shake. Every time I pass a truck just like his, or see someone with that same intense stare, I get the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he's still watching. Sometimes the scariest part isn't what happened, it's knowing it could happen again. If you made it this far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more stories that might just keep you up at night.